I noticed Earl Thomas Conley had never won a CMA award.
In the glittering world of 1980s country music, one name dominated the charts like few others. Earl Thomas Conley had 7 consecutive #1 hits and a voice so distinctive it could silence a honky-tonk. He was the blueprint for modern country music. But then something strange happened. Earl Thomas Conley simply disappeared. The rise. From nobody to Nashville royalty. Earl Thomas Conley didn't start life with any advantages. Born in Portsmouth, Ohio, in 1941, he grew up in poverty that would shape everything about his future. His childhood was marked by hardship, struggle, and a burning desire to escape the life he was born into. Music became his only hope, his only dream, his only possible way out of a future working dead-end jobs in a dying industrial town. As a young man, Earl worked every job imaginable. He painted houses, he loaded trucks, he did construction work that left his hands bloody and his back aching. But every spare moment, every break, every evening after work, he picked up his guitar. He wrote songs in notebooks that became worn and tattered from constant use. He practiced until his fingers bled. He knew that music was his only ticket to something better. The move to Nashville in the early 1970s should have been the beginning of his dream. Instead, it became a nightmare of rejection that would have broken most men. Record label after record label turned him away. Publishers dismissed his songs. Producers told him his voice was too different, too raw, too unconventional for country radio. He was too rock and roll for country, too country for rock and roll. Nobody knew what to do with Earl Thomas Conley. For years, he survived on nothing. He slept in his car. He ate one meal a day when he could afford it. He played dive bars for $20 a night. His wife worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat, while Earl chased what everyone else called an impossible dream. Friends and family back in Ohio told him to give up, to come home, to get a real job. But Earl refused. Something deep inside him knew that he had something special, even if Nashville couldn't see it yet. The breakthrough finally came in 1975, but it wasn't the explosion he'd hoped for. "Dreamin's All I Do" cracked the country charts barely. It limped to a modest position and then disappeared. Most artists would have celebrated. Earl saw it as proof that he was right all along. He could make it. He just needed another chance, but that chance wouldn't come for years. More rejection followed, more poverty, more nights wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake leaving Ohio. His marriage strained under the financial pressure. The music industry seemed determined to keep him locked out, but Earl kept writing, kept performing, kept believing when nobody else did. He refined his sound, blending traditional country with a rock edge that would later define an entire era. Then 1979 changed everything. "Dreamin's All I Do" was re-released, and this time it hit hard. It climbed to number 10 on the country charts. Suddenly, the doors that had been slammed in Earl's face for a decade began to crack open. Record executives who wouldn't return his calls were suddenly interested. Producers who dismissed him wanted to work with him. The man Nashville had rejected was about to become its biggest star. But Earl Thomas Conley wasn't satisfied with one hit. He'd spent too many years hungry, too many nights broke, too many days being told he wasn't good enough. He had something to prove, not just to the industry that rejected him, but to himself. He went into the studio with a fury, recording songs that showcased his unique voice, his songwriting talent, and his ability to blend genres in ways nobody else was doing. By 1980, Fire and Smoke hit number 1. Earl Thomas Conley, the man who'd painted houses and slept in his car, was now at the top of country music. The voice that executives said was too different was now the voice everyone wanted to hear. The songs they said wouldn't work were now the blueprint every other artist tried to copy. Earl had finally made it, but this was just the beginning. But Earl's success was about to explode in ways nobody expected. The golden years, king of 1980s country. The 1980s belonged to Earl Thomas Conley. What followed Fire and Smoke wasn't just success, it was dominance. Between 1981 and 1986, Earl achieved something that seemed almost impossible. 7 consecutive number 1 hits, not just chart toppers, but songs that defined the sound of country music for an entire generation. Songs that played in every honky-tonk, every radio station, every jukebox across America. Fire and Smoke was just the opening shot. Then came Your Love's on the Line, a song so powerful it spent weeks at #1. Radio couldn't stop playing it. Fans couldn't stop requesting it. Other artists covered it, but nobody could touch Earl's original version. His voice had a quality that was impossible to replicate, a raw, emotional power mixed with technical precision that made every word feel like truth. Holding Her and Loving You followed, and it became one of the most iconic country songs of the decade. The song told a story every cheating heart understood, delivered with Earl's distinctive vocal style that could break your heart and make you understand the complexity of human emotion all at once. It wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural moment. People didn't just listen to Earl Thomas Conley, they felt him. The hits kept coming with mechanical precision, somewhere between Right and Wrong, I Have Loved You Girl, Chance of Lovin' You, each one hit #1. Each one showcased Earl's incredible range as a vocalist and songwriter. He could do heartbreak ballads that made grown men cry. He could do up-tempo rockers that filled dance floors. He could do everything, and he did it better than almost anyone else in Nashville. But Earl wasn't just a performer. He was a songwriter's songwriter. Other artists begged for his songs. Keith Whitley, Conway Twitty, Blake Shelton years later, all recorded Earl Thomas Conley compositions. He had a gift for writing lyrics that felt universal, yet personal, melodies that stuck in your head for days. Stories that felt like they came from real life because they did. The collaboration with Randy Travis became legendary. Earl took the young singer under his wing, produced his early work, and helped launch one of country music's greatest careers. Randy never forgot what Earl did for him, never forgot the hours Earl spent teaching him about vocal technique, song selection, and navigating the treacherous waters of the music industry. Earl was generous with his knowledge, always willing to help younger artists even as he dominated the charts. Awards piled up, Country Music Association nominations, Academy of Country Music wins, Billboard recognition, sold-out tours coast to coast. Earl Thomas Conley was everywhere, his face on magazine covers, his voice on every radio station, his songs at the top of every chart. The man who couldn't get arrested in Nashville 10 years earlier was now its undisputed king. His albums went gold and platinum. Concert promoters fought over him. Television wanted him on every variety show and awards program. Earl had reached the absolute pinnacle of country music success. He was making more money than he'd ever dreamed possible, buying the houses and cars he'd fantasized about during those hungry years. He'd proven everyone wrong. But perhaps more importantly, Earl had changed country music forever. His blend of traditional country instrumentation with rock influences, his willingness to push boundaries while respecting tradition, his distinctive vocal approach, all of it influenced a generation of artists who came after him. You can hear Earl Thomas Conley in Keith Urban's early work, in Blake Shelton's vocal style, in countless other artists who grew up studying his records. By 1986, Earl Thomas Conley stood at the absolute peak of his career. 7 consecutive #1s, millions of records sold, the respect of his peers and the adoration of fans. He had everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed for, everything he'd dreamed about during those dark years of rejection. He was untouchable. He was unstoppable. He was king. But behind the success, cracks were already forming. The decline, when the music stopped, success in the music industry is fragile, and Earl Thomas Conley was about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. The same industry that had crowned him king was preparing to forget him. The decline didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing slide that began with whispers and ended with silence. The first signs appeared in his relationship with RCA Records. After years of massive hits, creative differences began emerging. Earl had strong opinions about his music, about production choices, about which songs should be singles. He'd earned that right through his success. But record labels don't like artists who push back, who demand creative control, who refuse to be puppets. The tension grew with each album. By the late 1980s, country music itself was changing. The urban cowboy movement was fading. New artists with different sounds were emerging. Garth Brooks was about to revolutionize the industry with rock-influenced stadium country. Clint Black, Alan Jackson, and others were bringing traditional country back in new ways. Earl's style, which had defined the early 80s, suddenly felt like yesterday's news to radio programmers always chasing the next big thing. RCA Records began losing faith when an artist's last few singles only reached the top 10 instead of number 1. Labels panic. Never mind that top 10 hits are still massive successes. Never mind that Earl was still selling out shows. Never mind his legacy and influence. The music industry has a short memory and an insatiable appetite for novelty. Earl Thomas Conley, who'd given them 7 consecutive number ones, was suddenly being treated like damaged goods. The battles with RCA intensified. They wanted him to change his sound, to chase trends, to become something he wasn't. Earl refused. He'd spent too many years developing his distinctive style to abandon it now. He believed in artistic integrity, in staying true to his vision. But integrity doesn't pay the bills when your label stops promoting your records. In 1991, RCA dropped him, the label that had made millions from his music, that had ridden his success through the entire decade, simply cut him loose. For Earl, it felt like betrayal. He'd made them wealthy, he'd been loyal, he'd delivered hit after hit, and they discarded him the moment the hits slowed down. Other labels showed interest, but Nashville is a small town with a long memory. Earl's reputation as difficult, as stubborn, as unwilling to compromise, spread through the industry. Smaller labels signed him for brief periods, but without major label promotion and radio support, his new music struggled to find audiences. Radio stations programmed younger artists. Fans moved on to newer sounds. The financial problems began mounting. Years of success had brought wealth, but Earl hadn't prepared for the lean times. Nobody thinks the hits will stop coming. Nobody believes the industry will turn its back. He'd invested in properties, maintained an expensive lifestyle, supported family members. When the money from new records dried up, the bills didn't stop. Touring became harder. Without radio hits, venues weren't interested in booking him. The sold-out arenas of the 80s became half-filled nightclubs in the 90s. Earl watched his career shrinking, his relevance fading, his legacy being forgotten by an industry that worships only current success. But worse than the career troubles were the health issues beginning to emerge. Years of touring, stress from industry battles, and the crushing disappointment of watching everything he'd built crumble began taking a physical toll. Earl started experiencing symptoms that terrified him: weakness, dizziness, problems with coordination. He ignored them at first, hoping they'd pass, but they only got worse. The man who'd fought so hard to escape poverty, who'd survived years of rejection, who'd reached the absolute pinnacle of country music success, was watching it all slip away. Radio no longer played his music. New artists didn't acknowledge his influence. Younger fans had never heard his name. Earl Thomas Conley, who dominated the 1980s, was disappearing from country music consciousness. By the late 90s, Earl was essentially finished as a recording artist. No major label support, minimal radio play, declining concert opportunities. The financial security he'd worked so hard to achieve was evaporating. The respect he'd earned was forgotten. Everything he'd sacrificed for, everything he'd built, was crumbling around him. Earl's troubles were just beginning. The fall, battles on every front. The 2000s brought Earl Thomas Conley to his knees in ways that would have destroyed most people. What happened to him wasn't just career decline or the natural fading that comes with age. It was a complete physical, financial, and emotional collapse that stripped away everything he'd worked for, everything he'd achieved, everything that made him who he was. The stroke hit him without warning in 2003. Earl was at home, living quietly, trying to accept his diminished place in the music world, when he felt the sudden weakness spreading through his body, the confusion, the disorientation, the terrifying realization that something catastrophic was happening inside his brain. His body wasn't responding to his commands. His speech was slurring. The room was spinning. By the time someone got him to the hospital, significant damage had already occurred throughout his brain. The doctors delivered news that shattered Earl's world. He'd suffered a major stroke that affected multiple areas of his brain. His motor control was compromised. His speech centers were damaged. His coordination was destroyed. But the most devastating news, the one that broke something fundamental inside Earl Thomas Conley, was what the stroke had done to his vocal cords and the neural pathways that controlled them. His voice, the instrument that had made him famous, was essentially destroyed. Recovery became Earl's new full-time job, and it was the hardest work he'd ever done. Harder than those years painting houses in Ohio. Harder than the decade of rejection in Nashville. Harder than anything he'd ever experienced. He had to relearn basic functions that every human being takes for granted. Walking without assistance became a daily challenge. Speaking clearly required intense concentration and effort. Using his hands for simple tasks felt like trying to operate someone else's body. Physical therapy sessions were agonizing. Therapists would work with Earl for hours, pushing him to regain functions that came naturally to everyone else. Take 3 steps without the walker. Pick up a spoon and bring it to your mouth. Say a simple sentence without slurring. Progress came in increments so tiny they felt meaningless. One day he could take 4 steps instead of 3. Another day he could hold a cup without spilling. These were supposed to be victories, but they felt like humiliation. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the horror of discovering what the stroke had done to his singing voice. Earl knew his recording career was over. He'd accepted that the industry had moved on without him, but he'd always had his voice, even if nobody wanted to hear it anymore. It was part of his identity, part of who he was as a human being. When he finally tried to sing during recovery, the sound that came out destroyed him. The power was completely gone. The range that had once spanned octaves was reduced to a narrow, weak warble. The distinctive quality that made his voice recognizable after just a few notes had vanished entirely. When Earl tried to hit notes that had once been effortless, nothing happened. His voice cracked, strained, and failed him completely. For a singer, this kind of loss is like a painter losing their eyesight, or a dancer losing their legs. It wasn't just losing a career. It was losing a fundamental part of his identity. Earl tried to adapt. He tried to work with what remained of his voice. He tried vocal exercises and therapy. He tried everything the specialists suggested, but the harsh, undeniable truth couldn't be avoided. His singing career wasn't just over because the industry had moved on. It was over because his body had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. Earl Thomas Conley, the voice that had defined 80s country music, would never sing again. The financial devastation that followed the stroke was brutal and swift. Medical bills from the initial hospitalization were staggering. Ongoing treatment, physical therapy, medications, and specialist appointments consumed money at an alarming rate. Without touring income, without new record deals, without royalties generating significant revenue anymore, Earl faced a financial crisis that grew worse every month. The money he'd made during the glory years, which had seemed infinite at the time, was evaporating. Properties had to be sold at losses. Possessions that held sentimental value had to be liquidated for whatever cash they could bring. The comfortable lifestyle Earl had built during the peak years, the security he'd worked so hard to achieve, disappeared completely. The man who'd once bought anything he wanted now struggled to pay for basic necessities. The descent from wealth to poverty was rapid and humiliating. Depression settled over Earl like a permanent fog. He found himself isolated in ways that had nothing to do with physical location. Old friends from the music business stopped calling. Some didn't know how to handle Earl's condition. Others had simply moved on with their lives and careers. Younger artists in Nashville had absolutely no idea who Earl Thomas Conley was. When his name came up in conversation, which it rarely did, people would ask if he was still alive. The industry he'd helped define had completely forgotten him. The isolation became crushing. Earl had always been a proud man, someone who'd overcome poverty and rejection through sheer force of will and talent. But pride becomes a prison when you desperately need help and can't bring yourself to ask for it. He withdrew from the few friends who still checked on him occasionally. He stopped answering phone calls. He existed in a world that kept getting smaller and smaller, bounded by his physical limitations and emotional pain. Watching the country music industry continue without him was a special kind of torture. New artists emerged every year with sounds that were clearly influenced by the work Earl had done in the 80s. The blend of traditional country and rock influences that he'd pioneered was now the standard template for mainstream country music. The younger generation of country music fans had absolutely no awareness of his existence. You could mention Earl Thomas Conley's name to someone under 40 and get nothing but blank stares. You could play Holding Her and Loving You, or Fire and Smoke, and they wouldn't recognize songs that had once been inescapable on country radio. Earl's music, which had dominated an entire decade, had been completely purged from country music's collective memory. His legacy was disappearing while he was still alive to witness it. Additional health problems continued emerging beyond the stroke. Complications piled on complications. Each new diagnosis stole a little more of his quality of life. Each new treatment required money he didn't have. Earl found himself dependent on others for basic daily needs, a humiliating reality for someone who'd always been fiercely independent and self-sufficient. By the 2010s, Earl Thomas Conley existed in almost complete obscurity. The man who'd had 7 consecutive #1 hits lived in poverty. The voice that had defined 80s country music was permanently silenced. The artist who'd influenced an entire generation had been forgotten by everyone, except a handful of people who remembered the glory days. Earl had fallen as far as any human being could fall, but Earl wasn't finished fighting yet. The legacy, remembered too late. Blake Shelton became Earl Thomas Conley's unlikely savior, but the rescue came tragically, heartbreakingly late. Blake had grown up in Oklahoma listening to country radio in the 80s, and Earl's music had been inescapable during those years. As a young singer, learning his craft, Blake had studied Earl's vocal technique obsessively. He'd learned from Earl's phrasing, his emotional delivery, his ability to make every word of a song feel true. Earl Thomas Conley had been one of Blake's biggest influences, and unlike the rest of Nashville, Blake Shelton never forgot. When Blake discovered that Earl was not only still alive, but struggling with poverty and health problems in complete obscurity, something inside him rebelled against the injustice. Here was a man who dominated country music, who'd achieved things most artists only dream about, and the industry had simply abandoned him. Blake decided to use his enormous platform and influence to remind the country music world that they'd forgotten someone tremendously important. Blake began talking about Earl Thomas Conley constantly in interviews. Journalists would ask about his influences, and Blake would launch into passionate explanations of how Earl's music had shaped his own style. He'd praise Earl's songwriting genius, his distinctive vocal ability, his pioneering blend of country and rock. He'd express genuine frustration and anger that younger country fans had absolutely no idea who Earl Thomas Conley was. Blake wasn't just paying lip service. He was on a mission. The advocacy campaign worked slowly but steadily. Music journalists, prompted by Blake's repeated mentions, began researching Earl's career and writing retrospective pieces. They rediscovered the 7 consecutive #1s. They found the influence Earl had on artists like Keith Urban, who'd also studied his vocal technique. Country music historians started including Earl in discussions about the evolution of 80s country music. Younger artists, curious about who Blake kept praising, discovered Earl's catalog on streaming services and realized how influential he'd been. Streaming numbers for Earl's old hits began climbing. New listeners discovered Holding Her and Loving You and Fire and Smoke, and understood immediately why these songs had dominated radio. Music critics reassessed Earl's contributions and realized that modern country music owed him an enormous debt. After years of complete obscurity, Earl Thomas Conley's name was being mentioned again in Nashville conversations. In 2018, Blake arranged for Earl to appear at several events, specifically honoring his legacy and contributions to country music. The industry turnout was impressive, though many people attending were learning about Earl for the first time. When Earl appeared, the sight shocked everyone who remembered him in his prime. The stroke had aged him dramatically beyond his years. He moved slowly with assistance. He spoke with obvious difficulty. He couldn't sing even a single note anymore, but his eyes still held that fierce intelligence and fighting spirit that had carried him from poverty to the top of country music. The tribute concerts were beautiful, but impossibly bittersweet. Blake Shelton and other major artists performed Earl's biggest hits with obvious reverence. Their voices filled venues with songs like Holding Her and Loving You, Fire and Smoke, and Your Love's on the Line. The crowds responded enthusiastically. Some were hearing these classics for the first time. Others remembered them from decades ago and sang along with tears in their eyes. Earl sat watching from a place of honor, unable to sing along to his own songs, tears streaming down his weathered face. Country music insiders felt genuine shame. How had they allowed this to happen? How had Earl Thomas Conley, who dominated the 80s with 7 consecutive #1 hits, been permitted to fade into poverty and obscurity? How had someone so influential been forgotten so completely? The industry's treatment of Earl became a cautionary tale that people discussed in hushed, guilty tones. It revealed something ugly about how quickly fame evaporates and how disposable artists become when the hits stop coming. But the recognition and tributes came too late to truly help Earl in any meaningful way. His health continued declining rapidly throughout 2018. The stroke damage was permanent and irreversible. Other medical complications kept emerging, each one stealing a little more of his remaining quality of life. By early 2019, everyone close to Earl understood that he was losing his final battle. His body, which had survived poverty, decades of rejection, industry stress, and a major stroke, was finally giving out completely. Earl Thomas Conley died on April 11, 2019. He was 77 years old. The news of his death spread through the country music community like wildfire. Social media exploded with tributes. Suddenly, everyone wanted to acknowledge his contributions. Major artists posted emotional memories and praise. Radio stations across America played his hits in tribute. News outlets ran lengthy obituaries detailing his achievements and influence. Blake Shelton posted a heartbroken tribute calling Earl one of the most influential and underappreciated artists in country music history. The outpouring of love and respect was genuine, but it felt hollow and tragic. Where were all these tributes when Earl was alive and struggling? Where was this recognition when he desperately needed it? Where were these radio stations when Earl was forgotten and broke? The country music industry was honoring Earl Thomas Conley in death, in ways they'd completely refused to honor him during the final years of his life. It felt like too little. Far too late for a man who'd given everything to country music. His influence became undeniable in all the retrospectives and analyses that followed his death. Music critics and historians traced direct lines from Earl's distinctive vocal style to contemporary country stars like Keith Urban and Blake Shelton. His pioneering blend of traditional country instrumentation with rock influences had essentially created the template that defined modern mainstream country music. His songwriting had influenced countless hits recorded by other artists over decades. His achievement of 7 consecutive #1 hits represented something few artists in any era ever match. The fortune Earl had accumulated during the glory years of the 1980s was completely gone. Years of mounting medical expenses, industry neglect, and financial struggles had consumed every dollar. Earl died without significant wealth, without the comfortable retirement his tremendous success should have provided. The man who'd sold millions of records and filled arenas left behind medical debts and financial struggles instead of security for his family. But his recordings remain absolutely timeless. New generations discovering Earl Thomas Conley through streaming services hear that distinctive voice and understand immediately why he was special. Songs like Holding Her and Loving You still resonate emotionally with listeners decades after they were recorded. His production work still sounds fresh and innovative. The catalog he left behind stands as permanent testament to his extraordinary talent, even if the industry forgot him while he lived. Earl Thomas Conley's story reveals everything wrong with the music industry's treatment of artists. He rose from desperate poverty through pure talent and determination. He dominated country music with 7 consecutive #1 hits. He influenced everyone who came after him. Then the industry forgot him completely, abandoned him to suffer stroke and poverty alone, and only remembered his contributions after death made it safe and easy. His legacy lives on in the music, but Earl deserved so much better.